It was the 1985 World Chess Championship, Garry Kasparov against Anatoly Karpov. Of course, Kasparov was known as probably the greatest attacking player of all time. Even then, his attack just known as a vicious attacker. Karpov, on the other hand, was known as probably the best endgame player, sort of the successor to Capablanca, a very positional player, hard to attack. That's why the whole chess world was astonished at what happens in this game. No one expected this to happen. Kasparov has the white pieces, Karpov has the black pieces. Let us jump right in. D4, at that time Kasparov was playing D4. He would later switch to E4. Knight F6, C4, E6, Knight C3, and bishop to B4. The Nimzo Indian defense. Black is playing for control of this E4 square. The knight aims at it. The bishop pins white's knight. That controls it. Kasparov just plays knight to F3, and now C5. Putting pressure on white's center, pressure on these dark squares, as well as E4. Kasparov plays G3, defying Keto, the bishop, place it on the long diagonal, and knight to E4. So this is a series of fairly unusual moves in the opening. The opening's a bit awkward. Karpov is piling up on this pinned knight on C3, threatening to take it with the knight, then the bishop with check. Queen to D3 from Kasparov. That defends the knight for the time being and also attacks this knight on E4. And Karpov plays queen to A5, leaving his knight on E4 hanging. But that's because it works out tactically for him. Kasparov does go ahead and take that knight. Bishop takes knight with check. Now, it looks like black is winning material here, right? If white takes the bishop, then queen takes C3 check, hitting the king and the rook. After king d1, queen takes. But there's a little trick that Kasparov has to keep him from losing that material, and that's this, just bishop to d2. Blocks the check. The knight supports the bishop, and so he's not going to lose an exchange here. Bishop takes d2 check, knight takes d2, and queen to b6. The main move here is knight to c6. But queen to b6 hits d4 through this pawn at c5, and also directly attacks the pawn at b2. Kasparov goes ahead and takes the pawn. Queen takes b2, rook to b1, queen to c3. So we talked about at the beginning how Kasparov was known as such a great attacking player. Karpov, the more positional endgame specialist. So it is Kasparov that would normally want to keep queens off the board for their attacking potential. But here, he plays queen to d3, offers the exchange of queens to his opponent. And he's not afraid of the endgame here, and queens do, in fact, come off. And there's something important to notice. When we talk about development in chess, people usually think of opening theory, playing a quick game, getting all of your pieces out early and attacking. But the truth is, development can be just as important in an endgame as in any other phase. Look here at how Karpov's queenside pieces are still on their original squares, and white has some open lines for attack. Knight to a6 from Karpov, directly aiming at the c5 pawn. d4, of course, simply defends it. Rook to b8, wanting to untangle on the queen side, maybe play b6, allow this bishop to escape. Bishop to g2, aiming at b7, king to e7, king to e2, both kings move to the center, and rook to d8. And we can see with these rooks, Karpov wants to either play b6 or d6 and liberate his cramped position on the queen side, but he's got to worry about tactics at all time. Kasparov plays knight to e4, aiming right at this weak d6 square. A knight on d6 could be big trouble for the black pieces. b6 from Karpov, and now knight to d6 from Kasparov. He places the knight on that very strong d6 square where it emanates, has a lot of power, but he does have to make sure it doesn't get undermined and get captured on d6. In the game, Karpov played knight to c7, but it's a fair question to ask, what if he goes ahead and takes on c5 with the pawn? Then Kasparov would have a very nice combination. He would take on b8, knight takes, then pawn takes c5. Now he's maintaining his knight on d6, but this pawn at c5 seems vulnerable. But if Karpov plays knight to a6 to attack the c5 pawn, then this shot, knight takes c8 check, rook takes, and bishop to b7. and Kasparov wins a piece. The game isn't quite over here. Karpov has some compensation uh, after taking the pawn at a2, but you don't want to get into that position in a world championship game. Kasparov is still clearly better. So he plays knight to c7. And in doing so, he wants to play the knight to e8 to challenge that d6 knight, make it move or exchange it. Rook to b4 from Kasparov, saying simply, I have a pin on this b6 pawn, and I want to pile up on the b file and force it either, basically to just force the win of the pawn, because black won't be able to add enough defenders. Karpov continues with this plan, knight to e8, to challenge that knight on d6. And interestingly, Kasparov doesn't fight it at all. He goes ahead, exchanges that knight, king e8, but now rook h to b1. And the loss of a pawn on b6 seems inevitable. Karpov plays bishop to a6, counterattacking the pawn at c4, threatening to take it with check. If pawn takes, rook takes, this pawn will be undefended. And bishop takes c4 check. So Kasparov moves the king to e3, gets out of the way of that potential capture. Now here, Karpov has been defending for a while. It looks like the best move here is rook d to c8, and white is a bit better in a complicated endgame. But Karpov sort of lashes out here. He plays the move d5, trying to put as much pressure on c4 and asking white, is he going to take en passant or take on b6? He goes ahead and takes en passant. If rook to d6, then c5, taking advantage of this pin on the b6 pawn. And tactically, this is bad news for black. And after rook d to d8, the move c6 is very dangerous, with the threat of c7 forking the two rooks. And there's really nothing he can do to completely save material. After rook b to c8, simply rook to a4, and the bishop at a6 will be trapped. There's nowhere on this diagonal it can go. It can't go to b7. c7 is taken. So that would win material. So instead, rook b to c8. And I think that was the mistake when he played d5, is that he didn't realize he can't take d6 without losing material. So he was not able to retake there. Karpov attacks c4 twice. King to d3, defend. Rook to d6. And now rook to a4, the same motif. And the bishop has nowhere to go. b7 is covered by the bishop at g2. But black doesn't have to lose a piece immediately. The move b5 allows the rook at d6 to defend the bishop at a6. So pawn takes, and again, there's a trap of the bishop. If it goes to b7, bishop would take. But Karpov was able to play rook to b8, a counterpin on the b pawn, and he was able to limit his losses basically to one pawn instead of an exchange or a piece. But rook a to b4 from Kasparov, and in this position, Kasparov has a clear advantage. It is, in fact, the attacker that has created the superior endgame, and he's the one that's going to be trying to win in an endgame. And his main advantage consists of this 2-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side. He simply wants to advance it as quickly as possible, move it forward, and either queen it or force black to give up a piece in order to stop it from queening. So bishop to b7, going straight into the double rook endgame. a4, starting that advance on the queen side. King moves up. Now h4, and this is a position where you see top players will often do this, where they just improve the placement of their pieces. He doesn't have to go forward yet. So he basically just gains some space on the king side before he continues on the queen side. h6, f3, gaining more space, controlling more squares. Rook to d5. Now rook to c1, aiming for the c5 square. And what Karpov did with rook to d5 is he wants to control this file, or excuse me, this rank, and try to exchange some pawns on g5. Rook b to d7. And now that there's only one rook pressing on b5, Kasparov goes ahead and plays a4 and starts his pawns rolling on the queen side. g5 from Karpov. One rule in endgames, if you're on the defensive side, you want to exchange off as many pawns as possible. Every pawn is a potential queen. You want those pawns off the board. Karpov is offering the exchange of pawns. After pawn takes, rook takes. He's aiming at the g4 pawn. g4 advances. And now h5, again, seeking the exchange of as many pawns as he possibly can create. b6. Kasparov ignores that, knowing that this b pawn has to be tended to. Otherwise, it's just going to cost black the game. So after pawn takes, rook to b7, he has to blockade the pawn. He has no choice. But now rook to c5. Kasparov seeks to exchange that rook, and then pawn takes, and the two pawns would be pretty much unstoppable. So Karpov wants to avoid the exchange of rooks, so he plays f5, blocking the rook's access. But just gh5 from Kasparov, the rook takes the pawn, and now king to c4. Now he wants to get his king involved in the action and assist the pawn moving towards the queening square. Rook to h8, bringing the rook back. King to b5 with ideas of king to a6, followed by rook to c7 check. So rook to a8 keeps the king out of the a6 square. And after this next move, rook b to c4, Karpov actually resigned. Now, we're going to look at why that was, but he saw the writing on the wall. So let's look at a couple of ideas. Let's say he moves his king towards the pawn. Then rook to c7 check, forces a pair of rooks off the board. King d6, and now he can just play b7. Because if king takes rook, pawn takes rook, promotes to queen. He'd be up a whole queen. And after rook to b8, then just king to b6, and the rook is going to c8, and that's that. Now, there is one trick Karpov would have. Kasparov would never fall for it, but it's rook to a1. The idea being if white queen's here, rook to b1 check, and he would actually get that queen. But in that case, what Kasparov would do is just play rook to c4. The rook can now block the check as well as control this file. So if rook to b4, rook b1, rook b4, rooks come off. And yes, Karpov can win the b7 pawn. The problem is Kasparov is going to win the rest of these pawns and win the game. The other move, I guess this is the computer recommended move, is king to f6, so that there is no check after the rook moves to c7, but that does nothing. Just rook to c7, rook a to b8, rooks come off, and then just king to c6. And the pawn advances, king goes to c7, and that's it. So, Garry Kasparov beats Anatoly Karpov at his own game. Kasparov, a brilliant attacker, but he could play brilliantly in all phases. Hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.